Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. My name is Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host Tigran Sloyan.
Hey Sophia, we're back again, and today we're talking about 3 key principles of good test design. And again, like on our other conversations, a lot of the focus here is on technical assessments because again, at Code Signal, that's what we specialize in, and that's what a lot of my expertise in. And even though some of these ideas of the things we discussed during this podcast apply to just broader assessment category, but really, our expertise is in, automating test design in the technical category. So let's dive right in. All right. So like when you're designing assessments, there are many constraints to be aware of. It's kind of like a tag of war where you have to, on the one hand, assess the skills that you've set out to assess, right? Because that's key. Why else you're building an assessment? That's the purpose. But then on the other hand, you have to deliver a great candidate experience. Because if nobody's taking it and you've designed a really beautiful assessment that measures all the right skills, but nobody takes it.
Right. So it's a balance that you really have to strike between how, how good of a candidate experience you can create as well as how comprehensive you can go. Because you could create, a 10 hour or a 1 week,
like a
multi-day, assessment, but nobody will take it. The completion rate isn't good. Then you're not going to generate a good data on it. Yeah.
And that's not even all. Then you have to also be aware of, are you introducing any sort of biases? Are you staying compliant? Are you, varying your level of difficulty too much as you sort of change your test?
Right, it's calibrated.
Exactly, right? So it's many areas, many constraints that you have to satisfy. And today I wanted to focus just 3 key principles that come up a lot that help you kind of satisfy all of these constraints and design really great tests.
And this one, we're assuming, you are creating tests, based on a framework that we talked about in previous episode, right? So if you haven't checked out the episode on the framework-based assessment creation, our audience should check that out first.
Yeah. So basically, kind of the way it works is our test design team has a giant list of key principles that they use to create these frameworks.
Right.
And then if we're ever designing a framework for a company from scratch, again, sort of all of these key principles come into play.
Right.
So a lot of these learnings are based on what we've discovered through research, through practice, of building these frameworks.
Right.
All right, let's dive right in.
Yeah.
So I guess the first principle is to not start from scratch. So the short way to phrase it is don't start from scratch. And what don't start from scratch means is that when you're creating questions like a coding question, a lot of the times you ask the candidate to implement it from scratch, which is
everything. So the blank piece of paper, you write everything.
Everything, right? You do the whole thing, which is helpful in some cases, right? If you're specifically trying to measure someone's code writing ability, can they translate English into code? That's very helpful, just seeing if they can write a lot of code from scratch. But in many cases, such as in specialized assessments, right? So let's say you're trying to measure a React engineer's ability to implement React components. You don't necessarily want to give them a blank slate and say, write your HTML, write your CSS, write every single render function that goes into this React component, because it takes way too long, right? It's on the one hand, you're trying to constrain the time. And from our experience, we've seen that keeping your assessments between 60 to 90 minutes is ideal, ideally on the lower side, but if you really need to measure a wide range of skills, you can go a little bit over and get closer to that 90 minutes. But anywhere past that, you're in dangerous territory, and your completion rates are going to start dropping off very, very quickly. So that first principle of giving them some sort of a boilerplate, and what we've seen is that, you basically get the same signal, right? To follow that example that I gave, if you give a React engineer some of the existing stuff, the HTML is done, the CSS is done, some of the React main boilerplate is there, they just have to finish it. You get the same signal out of them doing this versus them doing it from scratch. But the time that it takes them to complete this is 10 times less, which means now you have a lot more time to assess some other skills as well.
Right. And then in that particular case, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like what you're trying to assess is not necessarily can this person write everything from scratch, but more specific implementation or like ability to like understanding of a specific skills that you're measuring. So like basically you're saying just double down on what you really want to measure,
Right.
and then like, let the other one, be already there so that it's easier to complete, and then
Right.
you can move on to more important skills that you
You can have the
know.
time to do it, right?
Okay.
Because you really have to cram a lot of like different skills that you're trying to measure within 60 to 90 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And if all of the time from a candidate side is spent just kind of coding on that one single question,
Yeah.
then it just time runs out and you're like,
Right.
oh, okay, so I guess what do we do now?
Yeah, so it's really just the balance, like your priority of skills you want to measure, and then how you're going to allocate the test time to specifically measure those part, and then not the other part. So saying no to almost like other things you're not caring as much about.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the second key principle is keeping the topics inclusive, because I think we mentioned this on one of the previous episodes. A lot of the times when professionals design tests, meaning like someone who doesn't specialize in test design tries to design a test, they end up choosing topics like context of question that's sort of interesting to them personally, right? Because again, we're all human. We want to, the ideas that come to our head are relevant to things that we care about.
Right.
So if I'm someone who likes games a lot, right, I might sort of come up with a coding question that's about games. But then remembering that the goal of your test is to create a fair process for everybody. Not every candidate taking those assessments is going to be into games.
Right.
Not if you make it about baseball or soccer or football, not every candidate taking this is going to be into sports.
Right.
So
And then
keeping
they
it-
just like fumble on like, okay, what does that mean in soccer,
Right.
instead of actually being able to focus on coding.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Like a clear example I seen, there was a game, a couple of years ago that was really popular, 2024 or something. That game that you had to rearrange some numbers to get a 2024, 2028.
yeah.
Or 2056, something like that,
Right,
right?
it's
So
a
like that was
multiple of two
really
that you-
popular, and
yeah.
like people started making coding challenges about that. But like, if I've never seen or played that game, all of a
Right.
sudden that's like an extra barrier for me to be able to perform on this.
Right.
And all of a sudden the test is no longer fair to everybody taking
Yeah,
it.
'cause
Those
some,
who
some
familiar-
people who already have knowledge of how this game works,
right,
and then
they
some
get an
people just-
advantage, right? They get an advantage, and those who
And that's
don't get a disadvantage.
specifically things that we want to avoid,
Right.
keeping only a small part of the candidates keeping advantage, and then not to others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, the third key principle is combining different question types, including different question types. And what this means is that, if all you do is include coding questions, if your assessment was meant to design coding problem-solving ability, like our general coding assessment framework, sure, just coding questions do just fine. But like a lot of the times, you're trying to assess specialized skills. So if you're trying to assess like a JavaScript engineer, if all you include is coding questions, JavaScript, like a specialized assessment of JavaScript includes a lot of things. And measuring everything just based on their coding, one, you can't fit it into 60 to 90 minutes. It's going
Right.
to take way too long there. You have to include like 6, 7 coding questions. Each one is going to take them 20 to 30 minutes to implement. That's not going to cut it. And then some of those like ideas that or like skills that you're trying to measure can't even be measured through just pure coding. So like, for example, combining some quiz questions and not sort of trivia quiz questions, not something that you can just Google, not like what's an event listener, but something more like we call them code-based multiple choice questions, right? So like things that are hard to Google, like you give a piece of code and you ask them something about it, which is like, you can't Google that. You can't just be like, hey,
Right.
Google, what is this code doing? You actually have to read and understand it and then answer a question about it.
So kind of trying to ask the candidate question about your understanding or interpretation of this code,
Right.
so that we can measure, does this person actually understand this particular concept? in
Exactly,
JavaScript?
exactly.
Okay.
And the beauty
Yeah.
of that is that something like that takes like seconds. Like a coding question trying to measure the same thing will take like 20 minutes because
Right.
they have to do a lot of like legwork to get into whatever you're trying to measure. Whereas with this, within seconds, you got one more key thing that you were trying to measure. And then that's not the only type. There is like, if you really wanted to measure debugging skills, again, asking just like a pure coding question is not going to do it. So including something like a debugging question where the code is already there. They have to find a bug on like a line of code or something like that.
I see.
Again, provides an interesting combination, giving you like a spectrum of things that you can measure, and doing it within a pretty constrained period.
Yeah, it's a really great advice to be able to, well, not only have multi-dimensional skills you can measure, but also being able to, compact all the things into the 1 hour or 90-minute test that really maximize the things that you can actually learn
Right.
about their skills.
Yep.
Great, the great principles. Could you quickly summarize the 3 principles for our audience
Yeah.
before we end here?
Absolutely. So I guess to summarize, the first one is don't get your candidates to start from scratch. The second one is keep the topics inclusive. And then finally, include different question types to maximize what you measure from your assessments.
Great. Thank you for your advice. And for more tips and insights on data-driven recruiting, please visit ddr.codesignal.com.